Tom Uren would have turned 100 just a month ago. And on that day, I certainly recalled him and the impact that he had on my life as a mentor and as a father figure and as just an extraordinary Australian. And that's why having this lecture named in his honour, we have had prominent people. Obviously last year we weren't able to go ahead because of the nature of 2020, but we will be holding this lecture every year in his honour to commemorate his contribution to public life. Tom Uren was, of course, a prisoner of war captured in Timor, had, as he calls it, his tour, which went through Changi Prison, the Burma-Siam Railway, and he was in Japan very close to Nagasaki when the second atomic bomb was dropped. He survived that period as a Japanese prisoner of war and came home someone absolutely committed to peace, and someone who was an activist in the peace and nuclear disarmament movement, was a leader of the Vietnam War moratoriums here in Sydney, and became the member for Reid in 1958, and served as the deputy leader of the Labor Party under Gough Whitlam. He was the Minister for Urban and Regional Development in the Whitlam government, and helped to save many of the communities not far from here, particularly around Glebe and Ultimo and Pyrmont. He promoted public housing in that area as well as in Woolloomooloo and around the country, and was the first significant leader in Australia to really engage from the Commonwealth level in the nature of our cities. He was Labor's first ever environment spokesperson. Think about that. We didn't have one until the 1960s. And he then, in the Hawke government, was the Minister for Local Government and Administrative Services, and went on to continue to engage in cities policy and also in regional economic development as a great passionate advocate of local government and local decision making. Throughout his life, he saw Parliament as not being where politics is done. He saw that as an important vehicle, but that politics was done in the streets, in halls like this, in the community. And that was a big strength that he brought to politics, and it's something that's ingrained in myself, and I see myself as being very much a part of that tradition of engaging in community-based politics in order to change society, not just manage it. And Tom Uren continued to be an activist after his leaving Parliament. He said he'd left Parliament but not politics. Continued to advocate, and indeed got significant wins for former prisoners of war and veterans, and continued to be a passionate advocate for issues such as protecting Sydney's harbour foreshores. And in recent times in this local community, the campaign to stop the privatisation and the monetisation of Cockatoo Island and many of our precious spaces around our harbour would have been issues in which he would have been directly engaged, very much so. So I think this is an important thing to understand our history and to commemorate our leaders like Tom Uren, and I'm very proud to host this event, and Greenlee FEC will do so on an ongoing basis, I hope for a very long period of time, and we'll host it right here in Balmain, just a few metres from the Unity Hall, where the first ever meeting of the Labor Leagues happened 130 years ago, through when the Labor Party was, of course, formed, and as the world's arguably most successful social democratic party that we've seen over that period of time. I look forward to us writing future chapters in that history. Today's lecture is by Patrick Dodson. Patrick Dodson is the father of reconciliation, and Tom Uren had a great involvement with First Nations people, and he was an advocate of justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in his time as a parliamentarian, but also outside as well, participating in marches, participating in activity around land rights, and of course we see, and I won't foreshadow Patrick's address, but Patrick certainly will look at the role that Labor has played in the advancement of Indigenous Australians. Much work to do, and of course I have committed, and Labor has committed, to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. So a voice to Parliament, truth-telling through a Makarrata Commission, and working towards treaty as well. I think that in 2021 it's unfortunate that more than 4 years now after the Uluru Statement we haven't seen sufficient progress from the current government, and Linda and I, as the Shadow Minister, went to Uluru just before that 4th anniversary to recommit Labor to that task. Linda Burney will be the actual presenter of the address today, and Linda, of course, is well known in our local community here as the federal member for Barton and the Shadow Minister for Families and Community Services, but also for Indigenous Affairs. Linda Burney has a previous record of being Deputy Leader of the New South Wales Parliamentary Labor Party, but also a Senior Minister for Community Services and other portfolios in the former New South Wales Labor government. Linda Burney has been Australia's most prominent Indigenous parliamentarian in our history, and that is an outstanding achievement in itself. The first woman elected, Indigenous woman elected to the House of Representatives from any political party, and just last week we unveiled in our caucus room in Canberra our wall of women, all of the firsts of people such as Linda, Nova Peris, Penny Wong, Susan Ryan, and Ros Kelly, and more, women who have been the first of particular categories, be it ministerial roles or elections to the House of Representatives and the Senate. I'm very proud to lead a team now that has Linda Burney, Patrick Dodson and Malanderi McCarthy in our ranks, 3 senior Indigenous representatives, and at the next election Marion Scrimgeour will be running for the seat of Lingari to take Warren Snowden's place there in the Northern Territory. Denisha Duff is our candidate, a Torres Strait Islander woman, is running for the electorate of Bowman, currently disgracefully held by Andrew Laming, and we are hopeful of Denisha doing very well as well. So we are hopeful of having 5 or 6 First Nations people in our caucus, in our party room, as a party room of government after the next election. And I think that Linda, as the Indigenous Affairs Minister, will do our whole country proud in making sure that we turn what is good policy into action on the ground. We don't see the Uluru Statement as being a substitute for practical advancement and closing the gap. We see it as being a precondition. That is, it's hard to advance what some call practical reconciliation while you don't even recognise First Nations people in our Constitution, and that respect is an important step on closing the gap in areas of life expectancy, education, health and other areas as well. So I'd ask you to very much thank Linda and to welcome her to give the address today.
Hi everybody. Can I firstly start by thanking Norma for that fantastic welcome to country, and also reminding us of the very important point of respect for our elders. And this oration series, as Anthony has indicated, is very much honouring one of the great elders of our nation. And thank you, Norma, for this. Now, I know I don't look anything like Patrick Dodson, but seeing this is going to be recorded, I am going to absolutely stick to the words that Patrick has put enormous amounts of work into. Patrick is a wordy person, so it's a substantial piece of work, but it is also one of the best things that I have read that really encapsulates Aboriginal politics and the role of the Labor Party and the not-so-great role of our opponents. But what's fabulous, everyone, is that I know you all very well. I feel very much part of Anthony's electorate, the electorate of Grayndler, and of course next door to that is the seat that I represent in Barton. So can I join with Aunty Norma in recognising that we are in Wangal country and very close to the country of the Gadigal, and of course part of the great Eora Nation. What's absolutely also wonderful about today is the three men that I'm going to mention now I have known in different ways. This lecture series, of Tom Uren Lecture Series, Tom I knew in his latter life, not as a young man, not as a politician, but certainly as a wonderfully gentle, large, definite person in his later life. I have known Patrick Dodson since 1997, and that was something that came absolutely out of the blue when Robert Tickner called me and said, would you like to be part of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation? And Patrick was the chair at the time, and I got to know him really well. And I think in many ways, many of the lessons of my life came from Patrick Dodson. And of course, Anthony Albanese. I have known Anthony since the mid-1980s. He has never changed. He is a friend and someone that I attribute much of my career to. And I'm sorry I get emotional, but I do love this person. Now, I said that I would stick to what Patrick Dodson spoke about, but can I recognise the many people in the audience? I don't know if Larry Hand is here. Wow, is he famous? But I see Meredith here, and it's great that you're able to be here. I know that there are many others from local government, Lucille McKenna and Mark Jury, and many other people that I would like to recognise. But here we go with the words of the Father for Reconciliation, Patrick Dodson. I firstly want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we meet this afternoon, the Wangal people of the Eora Nation. I want to thank Norma Ingram for her welcome to country and recognise you all as fellow travellers in the path of truth, justice and equity. I want to thank Anthony Albanese, Labor's parliamentary leader, for having invited me to deliver this year's Tom Uren Memorial Lecture. I welcome the presence here this afternoon of Anthony's predecessor in the seat of Grayndler. I'm not sure if she is here, but let's all remember Janet McHugh for the amazing work that she has done over the years. And Janet, of course, was the Minister for Consumer Affairs in the Keating government. I also welcome those friends of Tom who are with us. Anthony recognised you. And I acknowledge the presence here of fellow parliamentarians. And of course, members of the Balmain branch. I'm not going to get into the argument about who was first, but I reckon I'm here in Balmain, of course you were first. And I also wanted to recognise all of you that are members of our party. Do you know Anthony said that Tom would have been 100 this year? Tom Uren died on Australia Day in 2015, and that's got to mean something. If he had been alive today, as we've heard, he would be celebrating his centenary. And when I looked at Tom's birthday, which was the 28th of May, one day after the referendum date in 1967, and that's got to mean something as well. The flyer promoting this lecture says he was a political activist and a parliamentarian, passionate about Indigenous land rights. He was all of that, and fearlessly frank with it. Take this passage from his autobiography, Straight Left, what else could it be called, published in 1994, when he's writing about a meeting of the Hawke Cabinet to discuss a scheme for material land rights for First Nations people, a scheme which was later abandoned. He said this: it was disgraceful. We know now, he said, that by vetoing Aboriginal land rights, Bob was doing a job for his mate Brian Burke, the Premier of Western Australia. I will return to this later, to that episode, but Tom Uren's forthrightness has prompted me to ponder the records of Labor and the Coalition in their dealings with affairs and policies that affect First Nations people. I must say at the outset that now you know this is Patrick because it's a really big word that I had to look up, at the outset that with some egregious exceptions, Labor over the decades had been for more understanding and accommodating of the interest of First Nations people than those who have sat opposite in the federal parliament. And let me assure you that it still exists today. Were it otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Labor has a conscience. The Conservatives, by and large, are conscious only of their own kind. With the exception of the Fraser years and the ministries of Ian Viner and Fred Chaney from the mid-1970s to the 80s, the coalition parties have demonstrated indifference at best, hostility at worst towards First Nations people, and their pleas for justice and recognition. By comparison, Labor's approach from the outset of Federation has been progressive and sympathetic. It is fair to say that much of the first half of last century, all federal governments gave scant attention to Indigenous affairs. There was, of course, the notorious Franchise Act of 1902, which denied Aboriginal people the right to vote. And for the record, Labor members were among the very few who opposed that provision. As the historian Judith Brett has written, the disenfranchisement of Aborigines was one of the infamous stepping stones of cruelty and shame in Australia's treatment of Indigenous Australians. But that treatment, maltreatment really, was the responsibility of the states. And in spite of several calls over the early decades of federation for the Commonwealth to assume control of Aboriginal affairs, which didn't happen until 1967, various federal governments were happy to leave it to the states. I should note here that the Commonwealth did have responsibility for the Northern Territory from 1911, but its treatment there of Aboriginal people, a large majority of the Territory's population, was hardly exemplary. And I have to say, and this is me, Norma and her mum, whom I remember very well, would have absolutely lived what it meant to be an Aboriginal person in New South Wales under the Aboriginal Protection, what a misnomer, and the Aboriginal Welfare Boards. Finally, international factors brought the role of the Commonwealth into sharper focus during the Second World War. Labor's Attorney General, and who does not know this history, Doc Everett was, in part, mindful of Australia's international standing when he proposed a referendum in 1944 to give the Commonwealth greater powers to drive the post-war agenda. Everett anticipated a heightened scrutiny of Australia's care for Indigenous populations, both here and abroad, given the principles enshrined in the Atlantic Charter, the agreement between Britain and the USA, which prescribed the principles of a new world order after the war. Among the 14 powers, and I found this just so interesting, Everett sought in 1944 referendum was for the Commonwealth to have the ability to legislate for Indigenous Australians. Back in 1994, everyone, Doc Everett. But that referendum was lost, and successive governments, principally the Menzies Coalition, were content to let rest the matter of Commonwealth control. And I grew up in the 50s and 60s, as many of you would have, and we remember well those long Menzies years. Labor was much more sympathetic. As early as 1959, the year after Tom Uren was first elected to Parliament, the ALP's federal conference adopted as party policy the alteration of section 5126, the race power, in the Australian Constitution, and the repeal of section 127 that said Aboriginal people could not be counted in the census. And that wasn't fixed till 1967. Both Norma and I were born and grew up as young women, young girls, at a time where we were not counted in the census. This is just so good. From opposition, Labor MPs Kim Beazley Sr. and Gordon Bryant were great champions of the policy, and Arthur Caldwell in August 1964 introduced a private members' bill for constitutional change. So we had been on this journey for a long time. Prime Minister Menzies was intransigently opposed to amending section 5126 to allow the Commonwealth to legislate for Aboriginal people. What should be aimed at, he told Parliament, the integration of the Aborigine into the general community, not a state of affairs in which he would be treated as being a race apart. And you have to say, don't you, some people just have not changed. In other words, assimilation was the order of the day, although these days I'm not sure that Menzies was happy that Aboriginal people continue to survive at all. I say that because I have been shocked to read Menzies' reflections to that archly conservative journalist, the late David McNicol, as recorded by Troy Bramston in his 2019 biography of Menzies. And this is gut-wrenching. Menzies said, "We have created an Aboriginal problem in Australia that did not need to exist at all. The Aboriginal is almost the lowest form of human native life," Menzies told McNicol 7 years after he had left office. Aboriginal people, he said, could not be compared to the Maori or the Fijians. And this is the man that ruled this country for a very long time. Bramston writes that Menzies went on to say that he had often wondered whether the right thing to do wouldn't have been to mark out a territory and put them, that's us, Aboriginal people, into it. How bloody charming. Out of sight, out of mind. And this is the same Menzies to whom the New South Wales Liberal Party Senator Andrew Bragg, if you haven't bought it, get it from the library, it's not worth buying, in the new book ascribes quiet achievements in Indigenous affairs. Quiet achievements, really. So quiet, nobody ever heard them at all. 8 years after Labor policy proposed constitutional changes, Menzies' successor, Harold Holt, finally put them to a referendum, which was passed, as I said, and as you know, overwhelmingly in May 1967. And one of the great people that fought for this referendum change was the very man that we honour today. Senator Bragg, in his book, which lays out the Liberal case for national reconciliation, writes in awe of Holt's achievements in putting the referendum to the vote. The fact is, everyone, Holt and the Liberals were years behind Labor's timetable, as I have outlined. The yes vote of more than 90% was not testament to Holt's advocacy, not at all. It merely reflected long pent-up frustration of the Australian people. A fair go. As it happened, Holt was quite unprepared for the hugely positive outcome of the referendum and took many months to shape a role for the Commonwealth in formulating and guiding policies relating to First Nations people. Worse, the Liberal Prime Ministers who succeeded Holt, those stunning examples, John Gorton and Billy McMahon, had no appetite for reform and were happy to sit back while National Party ministers stymied the aspirations of First Nations people. Well, I could have said George Christensen there, couldn't I? But I didn't. National Party ministers for the Interior and Territories and their like-minded departmental officials ran the Northern Territory as if it was their own fiefdom. They went out of their way to stifle any calls for land rights, and Tom Uren was onto them. Gurindji Stockman, and this is a magnificent story about the member we honour today. Gurindji Stockman famously walked off Wave Hill Station a few months before the 1967 referendum, and Tom took up with gusto their demands for proper wages and land rights, of course led by that old man, Vincent Lingiari. In October 1967, Tom did, he called for an inquiry into the grievances of the Gurindji strikers and told the Parliament, and I quote, "The people of Australia voted overwhelmingly at the recent referendum for a better deal, a fair go for our Aboriginals. For far too long, this minority section of our community has suffered injustice, cruelty, and inhuman treatment. Most sane and rational people in Australia want to ensure that the Aboriginals get a better deal. The eyes of the world are upon us," he said. The coalition government was unmoved. The Gurindji would have to wait until the election of the Whitlam government for the demands to be satisfied. And while the Gurindji waited, Tom Uren continued to advocate for their cause in parliamentary debates and question times, and his support continued long after he'd retired from Parliament. And this is Patrick speaking, and I just think this is so important. I clearly remember, Patrick says, his attendance at Uluru in 2006 for the celebration to mark the 40th anniversary of that walk-off. Tom was 85 years old, but still alert and determined to join in all the celebrations that marked that 40th anniversary. It took, as you know, the election of Gough Whitlam in December 1972 for the Commonwealth to take control of Aboriginal affairs. So whilst the referendum was passed by you in 1967, it was not until Gough came to be our Prime Minister that things were put in place. As voters had hoped in the 1967 referendum, he delivered. Just 10 days after he assumed the Prime Ministership, Whitlam appointed Justice Ted Woodward to advise on how land rights could be implemented in the Northern Territory, finally, which the Commonwealth would continue to control until 1978. The Woodward inquiry would lead to drafting the Northern Territory Land Rights Act, which was introduced in Parliament in October 1975, but never got through, and we all know the reason why. It never got through the Senate because the Whitlam government was dismissed a month later. Labor has been sympathetic for many years to Aboriginal demands for land rights, especially in the Northern Territory. As far back as 1963, Labor MPs Gordon Bryant and Kim Beazley Sr., both of them ministers with Whitlam, have been great promoters of the Irukala Buck petition, which rests this day in Parliament House in Canberra. The petition records the protest of the Uluru people of North East Arnhem Land against the Commonwealth seizure of their country on Gove Peninsula for a bauxite mine. I'll never forget, everyone, the first time I went up to Gove and everything was red. Of course, it was bauxite. The call of the Uluru for a parliamentary inquiry was backed by Labor opposition and eloquently supported by Kim Beazley. "We need to accept," Beazley said, not Beazley Sr., Kim Beazley, "to accept an obligation towards Aboriginal Australians today. We ought to be motivated by respect, by the desire to do justice, and by the recognition that there are obligations to make restitution for much of the past of our nation." The Uluru and their Labor champions in Canberra got no joy out of Menzies and his successors. The Conservative coalition formally and firmly turned their back on land rights on Australia Day, of all days, in 1972. Prime Minister Billy McMahon proposed a scheme whereby Aboriginal people could lease land instead for economic and social purposes. That ain't land rights. Immediately was born the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in the grounds of the old Parliament House back in 1972, and an early visitor was Whitlam. In his election campaign launched 9 months later, he promised to legislate land rights for Aboriginal people, not just because their case is beyond argument, he said, but because all of us as Australians, and this argument rings true today, everyone, with the Uluru Statement. He said, not because all of us Australians are diminished while the Aborigines are denied their rightful place in this nation. And isn't that as true today as it was then? The Whitlam government did so much more to honour the intent of the 67 referendum, as he affirmed to a conference of Commonwealth and State Ministers concerned with Aboriginal affairs in April 1973. The basic object of his government policy was, he said, to restore to the Aboriginal people of Australia their lost power of self-determination in economic, social and political affairs. Ever mindful of Australia's international reputation, he said, Aboriginal affairs represented in the eyes of the world a test for the integrity of humanity, of the whole of the people of Australia. The scope and scale of Whitlam's reforms in Aboriginal affairs were dazzling. He established the first Department of Aboriginal Affairs. He established the Aboriginal Land Fund, the Aboriginal Loans Commission, and the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee. He passed the Racial Discrimination Act and funded Aboriginal legal aid services. Remarkable. He poured money into the Aboriginal arts and resourced the teaching of Aboriginal languages in remote communities. So important to keeping culture alive. Tom Uren was part of that revolution. As Labor Minister for Urban and Regional Development with the Minister for Environment and Conservation, Dr. Cass, he established an inquiry into Australia's heritage. Importantly, the resulting legislation contained the first ever national measures to protect and preserve important Aboriginal sites. We have so much to be proud of. Whitlam's successor, the Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, was sympathetic to Aboriginal issues. To his credit, and in the face of stout opposition from the pastoral mining interest, Fraser's government passed Whitlam's Northern Territory land rights legislation, although we did wind back some of the measures. The Land Rights Act has enabled Aboriginal people to gain freehold ownership of half the land mass of the Northern Territory and has given them a right of veto over any development of their lands. Bob Hawke was elected in 1983 on the promise to expand land rights, which he identified as central to bringing the country together, and he promised to wield the Commonwealth's constitutional powers where necessary to realise that agenda. But sadly, national land rights were not to be. At that time, and this is Patrick speaking, I was the director of the Central Land Council and found myself right in the middle of upheaval as the Hawke cabinet wrestled with an aggressive mining lobby and Brian Burke's Labor government in the West. They both fought ruthlessly against the national land rights regime, especially one that allowed traditional owners the right to veto. To appease those influences, Hawke was even prepared to remove the veto against development on Aboriginal land that we enjoyed in the Territory to achieve a national order. In the end, his government simply abandoned national land rights. It was very, very difficult. His threat to bring the Commonwealth Constitutional Armoury to bear came to naught. By the way, right now, the mining industry of the West is resorting to the same old behaviours as it tries to subvert First Nations attempts to strengthen state legislation to protect sacred sites from marauding miners. Patrick's on the Duke and Gorge inquiry, so you can understand those sentiments. Tom Uren, in his autobiography, describes Hawke's retreat from national land rights and appeasement of Brian Burke as a disgraceful about-face, and it was. And so too was his failure to deliver in his 1988 promise of treaty. Instead, we got a program of reconciliation, which in the end never achieved its aim. And this is me talking. One of the great strengths, I think, of Bob Hawke is that he has, in his latter years, truly recognised the fact that he didn't deliver a national treaty and has listed it as one of his great regrets. But we did get ATSIC, and from Robert Tickner, the inquiry into the stolen generations. And from Keating, we got the Native Title Act in response to the High Court's Mabo judgment and the realism of the Redfern speech, and we all know that speech. All that unravelled during the hard years of John Howard. Howard was a mean-minded wrecker. Isn't that great? Mean-minded wrecker. The damage he did to relations with First Nations people was callous, calculated, and long-lasting. His so-called 10-point plan to please the pastoral industry after the High Court's ruling in week gutted Keating's Native Title Act. And I think that was the toughest of times for Australia. I remember it so well, and that's Linda speaking. It ripped this nation to pieces. His rejection of the social justice package, which I also worked on. In fact, that's where I first met Patrick, which Keating had promised as part of the Mabo settlement, was dishonoured. His refusal, absolute refusal, to apologise to the stolen generations was perverse and small-minded. And of course it took Kevin Rudd in 2007 to finally deliver that apologies. It all got too much for me, and this is Patrick, by October 1997. Only 19 months after Howard's election as Prime Minister, Patrick says, "I knew I could not seek reappointment as the chairman of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation." I was there that day. In my resignation letter, I wrote that I despaired for my country and regretted the ignorance of the political leaders who did not appreciate what was required to achieve true reconciliation for us as a nation. I said Howard's attempts to diminish the status and rights of Aboriginal people would not see history record great praise on this period. But worse was to come. There was the dismantling of ATSIC in 2005. I remember it so well. Howard and Amanda Vanstone doing that press conference. And shame on Mark Lathan for backing that. No surprise. Then there was the Northern Territory intervention, the most pernicious suite of policies ever inflicted upon First Nations people. I know people, some of you in this room, that have been so magnificent on that issue. But Labor did back that intervention, even down to supporting the suspension of Whitlam's Racial Discrimination Act, so that income management could be imposed on Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. But there's a great story coming on that, let me tell you. Labor under Anthony Albanese has opposed this government's fixation on income management and its determination to extend the reach of the cashless debit card, and you ain't seen nothing yet on that one. We've opposed the cashless debit card because it's racist and because the evidence is now in. Income management has not changed people's behaviours. It's just another way of punishing the poor. At least Labor under Kevin Rudd restored the Racial Discrimination Act when he got into government, and he did maintain other elements of the intervention, but they are being undone. And let's not forget Kevin's apology to the stolen generation, which Howard has so stubbornly resisted. Now commit this next fact to memory. And let us not forget, I know Anthony was in the Parliament that very day, and let us not forget also those Liberal MPs who left the House in protest against the apology. And this is the list: Don Randall, Sophie Mirabella, Dennis Jansen, Wilson Tuckey, Luke Simpkins, Albie Schultz, and of course, Peter Dutton. Dutton is the only one remaining in Parliament, but he represents the hardline rump of the Liberal Party, which will always stand in the way of policies to advantage First Nations. For instance, his argument against the voice to Parliament, the fundamental component of the Uluru Statement from the heart. Like others from the Coalition, he's wrongly characterised the voice as the third chamber. And as Anthony opened our lecture series today, Labor, on the other hand, fully supports the principles of the Uluru Statement. And these are those, I know you all know them well: a First Nations voice to be enshrined in the Constitution, and a Makarrata Commission to supervise the process of truth-telling and agreement and treaty-making. More than 4 years, as Anthony says, has now passed since the convention of First Nations people out at Uluru. It has been 2 years since Minister Wyatt announced to the National Press Club that he would develop, in the term of this Parliament, a referendum to recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution, and vowed to work on how we progress towards truth-telling. And I'm drawing to a close, or Patrick's drawing to a close. He then handballed the business of treaties to the states and territories. A voice, if it ever eventuates under the Coalition, would be a voice to government, legislated. That's not what Uluru talked about, not to the Parliament and not enshrined in the Constitution. But don't be fooled by the statements of various Coalition figures appearing to support the voice. When read closely, and I told you to get it from the library, don't buy it, many of these carefully worded endorsements ring hollow. Senator Bragg's book, which I mentioned, there's been a swathe of reverential reports. Isn't that a great word? Reverential, it's Sir Patrick. Reverential supports claiming he's a champion of the Uluru Statement. But those who have bothered to read his book, as I have as well, will know that Senator, and I did get it from the library, will know that Senator Bragg stopped short of calling for a voice to be enshrined in the Constitution. What he's advocating is a vague provision in the Constitution for First Nations people to be heard by the Commonwealth. Anyone familiar with legalese knows that would do nothing to change the current position of our people in this country. It would remain for the Commonwealth to decide by what mechanism First Peoples would be heard, and to demolish such mechanisms at will, just as we have seen with ASIC and National Congress. Those who have pinned their hopes on the Coalition, and there's no one in this room, in this bucket, and the likes of Bragg, to deliver a secured voice are extremely misguided. And who knows how and when, or if this government will ever embrace truth-telling agreement and agreement-making. Can I conclude by saying these things? Earlier this year, the Coalition joined with One Nation in voting against my motion, me, Patrick, to establish a committee to take the first steps towards truth and treaty-making elements of Uluru. As I said at the outset, it's only the Labor Party that can be trusted to deliver real benefits for First Nations people. Tom Uren will be proud of us now. We've got 2 MPs on the front bench and a Labor senator that are First Nations, as Anthony said. And we're hoping to increase, also as Anthony said, our numbers with the election of Marion Scrimgeour and Lingiari and Denisha Duff in Bowman. Further, our First Nations Caucus Committee, chaired by Senator Malandiri McCarthy, and including many non-Indigenous members, is a vital part of Labor's parliamentary machine. Tom Uren would be an honoured member of that committee were he with us in Parliament today. Once again, this is Patrick talking. My friend, Phil Glendenning, most of you would know Phil, the director of the Edmund Rice Centre, was a great mate of Tom and described him as a mentor to many who were bitten by the social justice bug. Phil said Tom lived a life for others. Despite the hardships of the Second World War, including 3.5 years as a prisoner of war in Thailand, and as Anthony said, in Japan, he had an overwhelming love and regard for ordinary people. Phil said that was best summed up in the final paragraph of Straight Left, and I quote, "In my years of living," and this is Tom's voice, "in my years of living, giving and serving our human family is the most rewarding achievement. When you walk down the street, the beauty of people's eyes and faces give you so many rewards. Packer could never buy that with his millions," unquote. At his funeral, Tom's son Michael said his father carried into later life the lesson he learnt in the POW camps, that the strong should look after the weak, the young look after the not so young, the fit look after the sick. In and out of politics, he campaigned for peace and justice. His causes included the anti-nuclear movement, opposition to Vietnam, devotion to the independence of Timor, Indigenous land rights, and the defence of civil rights, and a commitment to the urban and natural environment. As Phil Glendenning put it simply, Tom Uren made a difference. Thank you so much for listening. I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Library for their help. And can I add, as Linda Burney, with a father figure like Tom, it's no wonder Anthony has caught the social justice bug. Thank you, everyone.